Um, good morning, namaste, and good morning to Professor Parimal, Patil, and other friends who have joined from other parts of the world, and good evening to friends from India. I welcome you all to this Friday seminar. Now it has become webinar series of Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. On this platform, we had the privilege of hosting the lectures of renowned scholars who are established in their field of expertise related to philosophy. Through this platform, we invite various scholars who made significant contributions to their fields of knowledge to share their expertise and research with us. This platform provides an opportunity to our students, research scholars, and teachers to get exposed to and to get acquainted with the latest research that is happening elsewhere in the world. And today we are very fortunate to have Professor Parimal Patil from Harvard University with us. I have been reading his works for the past few years. When I contacted him a few months back, he kindly consented to share his knowledge with us. I appreciate this academic solidarity of him in agreeing to speak to us. Professor Parimal will speak for 45 to 50 or 60 minutes, following which we can have a discussion of 20 to 30 minutes. And now, without taking much time, I request Nivedita Chaturvedi to introduce Professor Parimal Patil formally. Over to you, Nivedita.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Good morning to Professor Patil. So I'm going to begin with a short introduction of Professor Patil. Professor Parimal Patil is presently Professor of Religion and Indian Philosophy at Harvard University, where he has been teaching since receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2002. From 2011 to 2017, he was the chair of the then newly formed Department of South Asian Studies at Harvard. His primary academic interests are in the history of philosophy in India and its relevance to disciplinary work in philosophy, South Asian studies, and the study of religion. The three programs which he also teaches at the university. His area of research is focused on Buddhist philosophy in India, the old and new epistemologists, and Indian traditions of physicalism and skepticism. He also has long-standing interests in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy of religion. His work, Against a Hindu God, Columbia, 2009, is a book-length work on Buddhist epistemology and the philosophy of language and mind that supports it. Its textual focus is the work of a Buddhist philosopher named Dharmakīrti and his critique of Nyaya inferential arguments for the existence of God. Buddhist Philosophy of Language in India, Columbia, 2010, which is co-authored with Lawrence J. McCrea, is a study of Gyan Sri Mitra's Apoha Prakaranam, monograph on exclusion, a text in which he develops and defends the famous Buddhist theory of Apoha. Gyan Sri Mitra and his student Dharmakīrti lived and worked at the monastic and educational complex of Vikramshila during the final phase of Buddhism in India. To quote Professor Patil, he says, "Philosophy at Vikramshila continues to fascinate me," unquote. At present, Professor is working on late Buddhist debates on the possibility of contentless consciousness, the metaphysics of relational properties, mereology, and an inference rule called Antarvyapti. Today, Professor Patil will be speaking to us on the topic Dharmakīrti on persons, where he'll be looking into arguments advanced by Dharmakīrti against the view which he calls Buddhist personalism, that is the belief in persisting entities such as the self or the person. I now invite Professor Patil to give his lecture, after which the floor will be open to questions. I request the participants to please type their questions in the chat box, which will then be taken up by the moderator. Over to you, Professor Patil. Thank you so much.
Great. Namaste. Thank you all so much for the invitation, to Professor Bala for inviting me to join your weekly seminar this Friday, and to Professor Chaturvedi for that very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here. I hope that this is the beginning of a longer and more sustained way of interacting with each other. It seems as though oceans are no longer such a barrier to us interacting, and I hope that, especially to the students, who are listening that you should feel free to be in touch if you have questions about the talk or in general about philosophy in classical India. I'm always happy to talk about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the paper, and as I do, please do note down questions and especially criticisms. I love when people critically engage with the work, and so you should not feel any, please don't hesitate in any way to really let me have it. If you feel that something I have said is inappropriate or wrong, I'm always happy to learn. So just a way of encouraging you to participate in conversation afterward. So without any further ado, I'll start, if that's okay. Almost everyone is taught that Buddhist philosophers deny the existing of persisting entities, such as persons and selves. And yet, from the work of Indian Buddhist philosophers from around the time of Aśoka to the 10th century CE, we learn of Buddhist philosophers who accepted their existence. This paper focuses on the Buddhist philosopher Dharmakīrti's arguments against this view, which I call Buddhist personalism. After sketching the broader historical and philosophical context in which this debate took place, I provide in section 2 a generic reconstruction of Buddhist personalism and the arguments that personalists offer in support of it. In section 3, I present 2 lines of argument that Dharmakīrti develops against personalism: his anti-emergence argument and his anti-agency argument. Section 4 argues that the success of Dharmakīrti's argument depends on the plausibility of his views on constitution and identity. Following an analysis of these arguments, I identify a philosophical choice point that accounts for the differing positions taken by Dharmakīrti and Buddhist personalists on the existence of strongly emergent entities such as persons. In conclusion, I assess the philosophical costs of accepting Dharmakīrti's arguments. In this way, I hope to set the stage for our discussion, in which we might engage with Dharmakīrti's own discussion of Buddhist personalism by considering what we would demand of Dharmakīrti and the personalists if they were here, and what they might demand of us. If the ethnographic remarks of the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, who traveled in India from 629 to 645 are accurate, at least 1/3 of the Buddhist institutions in northern India were affiliated with non-Mahayana Samitiya disciplinary orders. These disciplinary orders accepted personalism, the view that persons persist through time. Xuanzang identifies another 1/3 of Buddhist institutions in northern India as belonging to Mahayana orders. Some of these disciplinary orders, for example, the Buddha nature Tathagata Garbha movement, drew upon textual traditions in which the persistence of self-like entities was viewed favorably and selflessness was viewed skeptically. If Xuanzang is right, the majority of Buddhist intellectuals in 7th century India were sympathetic to the existence of persisting entities such as persons and selves. Both personalists and their critics agree that a false views about persons and selves are necessarily accompanied by a special concern for oneself, a personalistic fallacy, Satkaya Darshana idea, that binds one to the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that Buddhism promises to end. More specifically, this personalistic fallacy is said to be the cause, source, or foundation of the defects, taints, and impurities that necessarily result in the kind of longing that is the cause of suffering. For Dharmakīrti, the personalistic fallacy is the false view that there are persisting, unchanging, and ontologically independent persons or selves. The correct view, selflessness, nairatmya, is not just the view that there aren't persons or selves. It is also the view that whatever exists is selfless, which is to say, it is momentary. Personalists, too, had their own version of the personalistic fallacy. According to them, however, the fallacy is the view that there are no persisting persons or selves, or the view that one or more of the basic ontologically fundamental entities, that is the dharmas, is the person or self. Personalists take persons to be a type of entity that is dependent upon the 5 aggregates, each of which is a unique collection of entities that personalists take to be basic. The basic entities, the dharmas, include, for example, earth atoms, properties of such atoms, thoughts about such atoms and properties, compositional processes involving them, and affective responses to such composites. There are no basic entity types or entity tokens other than those in these collections. Persons, according to the personalists, are not basic. They are neither non-different nor different from the 5 aggregates on which they depend, which is to say that persons are neither non-different nor different from the basic entities on which they depend. Unlike basic entities, which are momentary, persons persist. A person then is a persistent entity that is neither non-different nor different from the basic entities on which it depends. Personalists take there to be such entities. Their opponents, like Dharmakīrti, do not. Before rephrasing the personalist position in more contemporary terms, it's worth thinking through their view in their preferred conceptual vocabulary of dependence, non-difference, and difference. According to personalists, persons are dependent upon, and yet neither non-different nor different from the basic entities that are the aggregates. Persons cannot be non-different from the basic entities on which they depend, because if they were, they too would be conditioned and momentary. But they cannot be. If persons were conditioned and momentary, they could not be the metaphysical justifiers of personal identity over time, memory, transmigration, or agency, such that the agent who initiates an action would be the same as the one who acts, and the same as the one who is affected by those actions. Persons cannot be different from basic entities either. If they were, they would be unconditioned and eternal, like the self of non-Buddhists. A person, like a Brahminical self, would not change, thus eliminating the possibility that by following the Buddhist path, a person could realize Nirvana. To motivate this view, personalists draw an analogy. They explain that persons are related to basic entities like fire is related to fuel. I've been told that many of you have read the Abhidharmakosha Bhashya passage at the end, and this is, of course, where this analogy is not starts, but where it's developed. According to one group of pre-modern Buddhist physical chemists, fire is constituted by the fire element. Fuel is constituted by the remaining 3 great elements: the water element, which is oil in the case of fire, the earth element, which is wood, and wind, which is oxygen. It might be helpful to think of fuel as a wooden match, a striker, and striking in the outdoors. Only fire has heat as an intrinsic and essential feature. Water has fluidity, earth solidity, and wind mobility. Fire is said to be dependent upon fuel, since fire requires fuel, in the sense that it is ontologically and conceptually dependent upon upadaya pradnyati, fuel. Fire is neither non-different from fuel, since fire has the property of being hot that fuel does not, nor is it different from fuel, since fuel is invariably present when fire is present. This quick sketch incorporates much of what we know about the personalist view that Dharmakīrti criticizes. By drawing out what is implicit in this view, I argue that person is best understood as a strongly emergent entity. Consider 2 putative entities, A and B. Let us assume that, like persons, A is dependent upon and yet neither different nor non-different from B, its base. In the case of persons, B is the 5 aggregates, and more specifically, the basic entities that wholly constitute them. Given what personalists tell us, we can draw the following 3 conclusions about A and B. If A exists, remember A is fire, A is person. If A exists, it cannot exist without B. A's existence is ontologically dependent upon the existence of an ever-changing collection of momentary B's. So, if a person A exists, it cannot exist without the aggregates, which is to say that it cannot exist without the basic entities that are the aggregates. Persons, therefore, are ontologically dependent upon this ever-changing collection of momentary basic entities. This dependence relation is symmetric in that a particular collection of momentary basic entities is also ontologically dependent upon the person. Second, A is in some way causally related to B's. Since A cannot exist without B's, it is sometimes said to be a synchronous effect of B's. Synchronous causation is understood to be a type of constitution relation, where basic entities are taken to be causes of the entity they constitute, even though so constituted, they are not identical to it. However, there is also a sense in which A is said to be an asynchronous effect of B's. Since B's are momentary, B's at T1 are asynchronous causes of A at T2, while the B's at T2 are synchronous causes of A at T2. Even though A at T2 is constituted by B, it too is not identical to it. To be a cause, either synchronous or asynchronous, is widely viewed by personalists as a criterion for existence. Dharmakīrti too defends a causal concept, causal efficacy, arthakriya, as the criterion for existence. 3. For 2 putative entities, A and B, A is non-different from B if and only if A tokens have all of the properties that B tokens have in common. Remember, we're trying to understand what the personalists mean by saying that persons are dependent upon and yet neither non-different nor different from the basic entities, the skandhas. So we've talked about ontological dependence. Now we're trying to understand what non-difference and different mean. So for 2 putative entities, A and B, that is for 2 putative entities, say, person and skandhas or dharmas, A is non-different from B if and only if A tokens have all of the properties that B tokens have in common. Most relevant in this context is the property being momentary. For 2 putative entities, A and B, A is different from B if and only if A has at least one property that contradicts a property that B tokens have in common. 2 properties contradict each other if and only if they cannot share a locus, that is, be predicated of the same entity A or B. In the case of persons, what is relevant is that the A property persistence, actually in the case of persons, what is relevant is the A property persistence, which is incompatible with the B property momentariness. What is the best way to understand A is dependent upon and yet neither different nor non-different from B, as personalists interpret it? If personalists were to respond in contemporary terms, they would insist that A's and A properties emerge from B's and B properties, or so I will argue. It may be helpful, however, to see first why personalists would not endorse epiphenomenalism or supervenience, as both are generally, if not generically understood. Suppose that A and A properties are epiphenomena of B and B properties, when A is ontologically dependent upon B and B properties, such that B and B properties can affect A and A properties, but A and A properties cannot affect B and B properties. A and A properties are mere spectators. Personalists accept that persons are ontologically dependent upon their aggregates, and that their aggregates are synchronous and asynchronous causes of persons, but also that persons can and do affect the aggregates. Persons are not mere witnesses, they are agents. That persons can and do affect the aggregates has to be the personalist's position. After all, according to them, the practice of Buddhism is such that it is the practice of persons that leads to changes in the aggregates in such a way that thought tokens can be eliminated or added, and that with successful practice, the affliction tokens that obstruct nirvana can too. Secondly, persons do not seem to supervene upon their aggregates. Let us assume that A and A properties supervene on B and B properties, if and only if A and A properties are ontologically dependent upon B and properties, in the sense that A and A properties cannot exist without B and B properties. And two, if and only if exact similarity at the level of both types and tokens with B and B properties guarantees exact similarity at the level of both types and tokens with A and A properties. Such supervenience relations are generally taken to be reflexive, transitive, and non-symmetrical, in the sense that some are symmetric and some are asymmetric. In the Indian context, the modal force of guarantees would be understood most likely in terms of nomological rather than metaphysical necessity. What can we say about the personalists' dependent yet neither different from nor non-different from relation, RP? Is it a form of supervenience? I think not, since RP is neither reflexive, nor transitive, nor non-symmetric. For RP to be reflexive, A, persons, would have to be both ontologically dependent upon A, which it is, but also neither different from nor non-different from A, which it is not. A, as a person, cannot be neither different nor non-different from A itself, since to be so, it would have to be the locus of two incompatible properties, which it cannot be. If you recall, that was one of the criteria for being different. For RP to be transitive, the following would have to be the case. When A is neither different nor non-different from B, and B is neither different from nor non-different from C, A would have to be neither different from nor non-different from C. RP cannot be anything other than vacuously transitive, since there are no other basic entities that the aggregates could be dependent upon and yet be neither different nor non-different from. For RP to be non-symmetrical, there should be different pairs of entities A and B, such that RP is symmetrical in some cases and asymmetrical in other cases. The relation RP is not reflexive, even trivially, and there does not seem to be an entity pair A and B such that RP is symmetric. The relation is asymmetric. Consider, for example, two sets of aggregates, B1 and B2, that are different at the level of types. B1 is an ordinary person, constituted by basic entities, including those of the affliction type. B2 is an accomplished Buddhist practitioner, an arhat, constituted by the same types of basic entities as B1, but without any of the affliction type. Both the ordinary person and the arhat, however, are persons, even though their B and B properties are different. To say that A and A properties are dependent upon, yet neither different nor non-different from B and B properties, is to say that A and A properties are both dependent upon and autonomous from B and B properties. The nature of this dependence and autonomy is such that, in my view, personalists should say that A strongly emerges from B. That is, that persons strongly emerge from the dharmas. The nature of this emergence is strong and not weak, since while persons are wholly constituted by the basic entities that are the aggregates, they are not wholly metaphysically determined by them. Moreover, there isn't causal closure with respect to basic entities, according to which only basic entities affect basic entities. There are three features of the dependence that personalists take there to be between persons and unique person properties, such as persistence, and aggregate properties, such as impermanence. One, persons cannot exist without the aggregates, and so they are ontologically dependent upon them, which is to say that they depend on the ever-changing collection of momentary basic entities that the aggregates are. Two, persons are wholly constituted by the basic entities that are the aggregates, and as a result, they are synchronous effects of them. And three, persons are asynchronous effects of aggregates. Since aggregates are momentary, aggregates at T1 are asynchronous causes of the person at A2, while the aggregates at T2 are synchronous causes of the person at T2. Even though a person at T2 is wholly constituted by the aggregates at T2, it is not identical to them. As imagined by personalists, the dependence between persons and aggregates is ontological, compositional, and causal. Persons and person properties are also autonomous from aggregates and aggregate properties. Recall that according to personalists, persons are neither non-different nor different from aggregates, which is to say that persons have all of the properties that aggregates have in common, and at least one of the properties that is incompatible with a property that the aggregates have in common. Most notably, persons persist while aggregates are momentary. Persons are autonomous in the sense that they have at least one novel property, persistence. They are also said to have distinctive causal efficacy, since persons can be agents while aggregates can not. Dharmakīrti does not refer to personalists by name. Nevertheless, the terminology that he uses, which include the term person to phrase his opponent's position in the Pramanavartika, for example, and the Pramanavinishchaya, makes it clear that he has personalists in mind. There are at least two lines of argument that Dharmakīrti develops against the personalists. In the first, which I call the Anti-Emergence Line, Dharmakīrti argues that there cannot be a metaphysically real entity A that is dependent upon and yet neither different nor non-different from a metaphysically real entity B, as personalists take persons to be. Although his discussion is short, the philosophical insights that he relies upon are developed in the extensive discussion of his argument that destruction is spontaneous, the vinashitva anumana, which is one of his two primary arguments in support of momentariness. Interestingly, his discussion of this argument comes right before his arguments against personalism. In his second line of argument, which I call the anti-agency line, Dharmakīrti argues that persisting persons cannot be agents. Rather, it is only momentary entities that can be agents. Persistence and agency are incompatible properties. Again, although his discussion is short, the philosophical insights that he relies on are developed elsewhere, this time in his extensive discussion of the existence inference for momentariness, the sattva anumana. By drawing on philosophical resources that he develops in his arguments for the metaphysics of momentariness, Dharmakīrti creates a toolkit that he relies on to address a range of issues in metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. In his argument against personalists, the relevant tools are most closely related to his views on composition, causation, and the metaphysics and epistemology of difference and non-difference. First, the anti-emergence line of argument. Dharmakīrti takes destruction to be an intrinsic feature of all things. By this, he means that the destruction of real things does not require a cause that is not already among the causes for the existence of that thing. Destruction is without a cause, and in this sense, it is spontaneous. In defending this position, Dharmakīrti lays the groundwork for his views on how real things are related to real things. In contrast to personalists, Dharmakīrti argues that if an entity A is metaphysically real, it must be either different or non-different from a metaphysically real thing B. Let us refer to this as the difference principle. That this is Dharmakīrti's view is clear from the numerous places in which it is explicitly stated. In his discussion of the argument for spontaneous destruction, he draws attention to a feature of this principle that elicits a response from a personalist. Dharmakīrti considers the following objection to his argument that destruction is spontaneous. An opponent says, consider two entities, A and B. Suppose that A is a property possessor, a dharmi, such as a pot, and B is a property, such as spontaneous destruction. According to your view, and in accordance with the difference principle, if B is a metaphysically real property, it must be either different or non-different from its metaphysically real possessor A. But if B, the property spontaneous destruction, were different from its possessor A, we would have knowledge of it as such, but we don't. And if B were non-different from its possessor A would always possess the property spontaneous destruction. But if it did, you could not account for true statements, such as A was destroyed, which conveys that there was a time when A was not destroyed. The property B, spontaneous destruction, is therefore not different from its metaphysically real property possessor A, and it is also not non-different from its metaphysically real property possessor A. Given the difference principle, property B cannot be metaphysically real. As the opponent suggests, Dharmakīrti now has to give up the difference principle or his view that the property, spontaneous destruction, is a metaphysically real property of metaphysically real things. Dharmakīrti cannot have his cake and eat it too. Dharmakīrti's response shows why he can, or why he thinks he can. Dharmakīrti explains that, on his view, property possessors and properties are just not metaphysically real things. A metaphysically real thing is just a collection of property particulars that we take to wholly constitute it. The so-called property possessor A and property B are wholly intentional objects. They are abstractions or conceptual objects that are constructed on the basis of criteria that are of no metaphysical significance. At best, they are conceptually real, and conceptual possibilities need not track with metaphysical realities. Therefore, in this case, there isn't a metaphysically real thing A and a metaphysically real thing B, such that B has to be either different or non-different from A. The difference principle does not apply. It only applies to metaphysically real things. It is at this point that the personalist jumps in. By insisting that wholly intentional objects are not subject to the difference principle, a personalist points out that Dharmakīrti has conceded that the principle is not universally applicable. He has thus opened the door to there being a type of entity A that is neither different nor non-different from an entity of type B. As an example, the personalist refers to persons and aggregates. A token person is not different from the token 5 aggregates that are its base, since to be different from is to be completely unrelated. And a person is causally related to the aggregates, which are its synchronous and asynchronous cause. A person is not non-different from the aggregates, since a person has at least one property that is incompatible with a property common to all of the basic entities that are the aggregates. After all, persons persist and aggregates are momentary. In responding to this, Dharmakīrti targets the personalist view that persons and aggregates are related through RP as effect and cause. He argues that their view makes a mockery of causation. If RP, remember, RP is the relation of being dependent and yet neither different nor non-different from. If RP were a causal relation, an entity A, an effect, would have to be neither different nor non-different from its cause, entity B. But if B is non-different from A would be a synchronous cause, B would be a synchronous cause of A, which is just to say that B would wholly constitute A, even though it would not have to be identical to it. If B is not non-different from A, B would be an asynchronous cause of A, which is just to say that B would have to be different, at least temporally, from A. As a result, it seems as though each and every entity A would be a cause, since A wholly constitutes itself and is therefore an asynchronous cause of itself. And yet, it seems as though each and every entity A would be an effect, since at least in some way, it is different from B. RP makes a mockery of causation, since it allows any two things to be related as effect and cause. As Dharmakīrti sees it, the source of this problem is the personalist's misunderstanding of different from, and therefore non-different from. According to Dharmakīrti, two real entities, A and B, are different if and only if they have non-overlapping natures. Amishri bhava is the phrase, which is to say that A properties do not overlap with all B properties that B's have in common. Two real entities, A and B, are non-different if and only if A properties overlap, at least partially, with B properties, such that all B properties are A properties, but all A properties need not be B properties. For Dharmakīrti, non-different from and different from are contradictory for real entities. That is, for entities that exist. More specifically, for two real objects, A and B, B can be related to A either through a relation of essential similarity, this is tadatmya, or causal relation, tadutpatti, when they are related. In Dharmakīrti's stock example, a token Shimshipa tree is related to every other tree token through a relation of essential similarity, while a fire token is related to relevant smoke token through a causal relation, RC. So RS is the relation of essential similarity, tadatmya. RC is the causal relation, tadutpatti. According to Dharmakīrti, there is no other way for two real entities to be related to one another. Consider two putatively real objects, A and B. The objects may be things like trees or properties, such as being a tree. For Dharmakīrti, objects and property types are fully constituted by their trope-like property particulars. For B to be essentially similar to A, all B property particulars have to be compatible with all A property particulars. But all A property particulars do not have to be compatible with all B property particulars. Two property particulars are compatible if and only if they can be co-located. For example, the property being a shimshipa tree is compatible with the property being a tree, but it is incompatible with the property being a mango tree. The relation of essential similarity is non-symmetric in that while B bears essential similarity relation RS to A need not bear essential similarity relation RS to B. For B to be causally related to A, it is necessary but not sufficient that some B property particulars be compatible with some A property particulars. In addition, it is also necessary but not sufficient that some B property particulars be incompatible with some A property particulars, which is to say that some B property particulars cannot be co-located with any A properties. A must have non-overlapping natures. Causal relations are asymmetric. While B bears causal relation RC to A cannot, rather than just need not, bear causal relation RC to B, at least according to Dharmakīrti. So personalists take persons and aggregates to be metaphysically real entities, which means that both are subject to the difference principle. Since personalists deny persons are non-different from the aggregates, Dharmakīrti reasons that persons must be different from the aggregates, according to them. After all, persons have an A property, persistence, that is incompatible with the B property that is shared by all Bs, namely momentariness. However, if persons are different from the aggregates, they must be related to them through a causal relation, RC. The problem is not just that personalists have failed to show this. It is also that, according to Dharmakīrti, the metaphysics and epistemology of causation are such that personalists cannot show that persons and aggregates are related to each other as effect and cause. More generally, there cannot be any metaphysically real entity that is related to metaphysically real entity B through RP. There are no strongly emergent entities. The second line of argument that Dharmakīrti develops is the anti-agency line of argument. The anti-agency line of argument is the second line of argument that Dharmakīrti develops against personalism. Here, his target is not just the existence of strongly emergent entities. Rather, it is the personalist's claim that persons are agents. As before, his argument depends on his understanding of the metaphysics of difference and non-difference. According to Dharmakīrti, persisting persons cannot be agents, since when it comes to their own agency, they are not independent. That is to say, on their own, independent of external causes, persisting persons cannot exercise or be affected by their agency, which is just what it means to be an agent. To be an agent, persons have to change. But, according to Dharmakīrti, change is impossible for any persisting entities, including persons. Change and agency are only possible for momentary entities, that is, entities that are selfless. The notion of person as a persisting agent is, according to Dharmakīrti, incoherent, since agency is incompatible with persistence. A persisting entity cannot change, he reasons, since if it changes in any way, temporal position, spatial position, gain or loss of any of the trope-like property particulars that we take to constitute it, it would be a different entity. According to Dharmakīrti, a persisting entity has to be wholly present at every moment it persists. For Dharmakīrti, endurance is the only form of persistence. Dharmakīrti motivates this view by drawing on philosophical resources he develops in defending his inference from existence, his most important argument in support of his momentariness thesis. As a part of his defense, he tries to show that persisting entities cannot bring about effects, either gradually, that is over time, or simultaneously, that is at one time. Since over time and at one time only exhaust the possibilities, Dharmakīrti concludes that persisting entities cannot be causally efficacious. To support this view, Dharmakīrti asks us to, first, suppose that at T1, an entity B is not a cause of an entity A, while at T2, entity B is a cause of entity A. Suppose, for example, that at T1, B is a seed that produces a sprout A at some future time T2. Like the seed and sprout, entity B is not a cause of A at T1, while it is a cause of A at T2. For this to be possible, entity B at T2 has to be different from entity B at T1. For this to be possible, entity B at T1, when it's not a cause, has to be different from entity B at T2, when it is a cause. If this were not the case, we would have to admit that B is the locus of two incompatible properties. That is, not being a cause and being a cause. But this is absurd. Since B cannot be wholly present at T1 and T2, it cannot be a persisting entity. Second, now suppose that entity B is the cause of an entity A at T1, while at T2, B is not a cause of A. Suppose, for example, that B is a seed that produces a sprout A at T1. At T2, B is no longer a cause of the sprout A, even though it was a cause of it at T1. Entity B at T1 has to be different than entity B at T2. If this were not the case, we would have to admit that B is the locus of two incompatible properties, that is, not being a cause and being a cause. But this is absurd. Finally, a persisting entity B cannot be a cause of entity A at one time only, say T1. This is because if B were a cause of A at T1, since it is supposed to persist and therefore not change, it would have to be a cause of A at T2 and T3, etc. It would always be a cause. On the basis of this analysis, Dharmakīrti concludes that persisting entities cannot have causal powers. They cannot be causally efficacious. Because they do not change, they cannot be causes over time or even at a time. This is bad news for personalists, for whom persisting persons are supposed to be agents who can make progress along the Buddhist path to Nirvana by exercising their agency and being affected by it. Persons have to change. But since personalists claim that persons persist, they cannot change. And so, according to Dharmakīrti, they cannot be agents. All right. So what is Dharmakīrti's debate with the personalists most fundamentally about? As I have presented it, the debate is structured around three relations and their relata. RP, the personalist dependent upon and yet neither different nor non-different from relation, that I have argued is a relation of strong emergence between entity A persons and the basic entity B that are the aggregates. 2, RS, Dharmakīrti's non-symmetric relation of essential similarity between entities B and A, including the wholly intentional property, spontaneous destruction, and property possessor, pot. And 3, RC, Dharmakīrti's asymmetric causal relation between entities B and A. Each of these relations is characterized in terms of difference and non-difference. Moreover, relations RS and RC define Dharmakīrti's different principle for metaphysically real, though not wholly intentional, entities. It is clear, I take it, that a fundamental issue, if not the fundamental issue in this debate, is the metaphysics of difference and non-difference. In the personalist relation RP, A is neither different nor non-different from B. Difference is defined by A having at least one property that is incompatible with the property that all of the basic entities that are B have in common. Non-difference is defined by A being wholly constituted by B. even though A is not identical to B. There's at least one pair of entity types, A and B, such that A is related to B through RP, namely persons and aggregates. Dharmakirti's relations RS and RC can also be characterized in terms of non-difference and difference, respectively. Dharmakirti's relation RS, the non-symmetric relation of essential similarity, tadatmya, relates non-different entities B and A. B and A may be wholly intentional or metaphysically real. Non-difference is defined by all B's being A, even though all A and A properties need not be B and B properties. RC, the causal relation, relates an entity B with a different entity A when B and A are related. Difference is defined by B having some B property particulars that are compatible with A property particulars, and some B property particulars that are incompatible with A property particulars. Since B and A are wholly constituted by their property particulars, and B and A have incompatible property particulars, B and A are different in the sense that they have non-overlapping natures. Again, B and A may be wholly intentional or metaphysically real. For Dharmakirti, A cannot be wholly constituted by B and B properties and not be identical to B. This is the critical choice point between Dharmakirti and the personalists. One consequence of taking different positions on constitution and identity is that an entity pair A and B that is non-different, according to personalism, could be different for Dharmakirti, as is the case with persons and aggregates. This difference about difference is critical for Dharmakirti's anti-emergence line of argument, which shows that since persons and aggregates are different, personalism fails, since personalists have not shown and cannot show that persons are related to aggregates through RC, which is the only way two different metaphysically real entities could be related. It is also at the heart of his anti-agency line of argument, through which he seeks to show that only momentary entities can be agents. Notice that as presented by Dharmakirti, the anti-emergence line of argument does little more than shift the burden of proof to the personalists, who must now defend their understanding of non-difference or show that A and B are causally related. The force of burden shifting is in this case directly related to the plausibility of Dharmakirti's own views on constitution and identity, as well as causation. After all, it is the plausibility of these views, or the promise that they are plausible, that gives force to this strategy. As we have seen, underlying both the personalists and Dharmakirti's views on difference and non-difference are their views on constitution and identity. According to Dharmakirti's difference principle, for any metaphysically real entities A and B, if entity A is metaphysically real, it must be related to metaphysically real thing B, person aggregates, from which it is either different or non-different. That is, if A is metaphysically real, it must be related to metaphysically real thing B by either RC or RS. For personalists, if an entity A is metaphysically real, it could be related to a metaphysically real thing B, from which it is neither different nor non-different. That is, if A is real, it could be related to a real thing B by both RC and RS jointly. The force of must in Dharmakirti's difference principle is due to his view that RS and RC exhaust the possibilities for how any pair of existence, A and B, can be related to one another. One important point that is generally suppressed in Dharmakirti's own discussion of difference and non-difference is his view that causal relations do not exist. According to him, there isn't a metaphysically real relation RC that is either different or non-different from a metaphysically real entity A or B. RC is an abstraction, a relational property that is not different from either A or B. RC is wholly intentional. Given this, RC has to be related to A or B through RS, which is to say that B causing A is just one of the property particulars that is A, just as spontaneous destruction is a property particular of all A's. There are two ways in which this seemingly irrelevant, which may seem seemingly irrelevant, is actually directly relevant to his debate with the personalists. And we're coming to an end here. Dharmakirti's view that when two related entities, B and A, are different, they must be related through RC, rests on him being able to show how RC can be established for B and A, or more specifically, how the presence of RC as a property token in B, if A is taken to be the effect of B. Without providing such an account, his claim that personalists have to show that the person and aggregates are related through RC, which is to say they have to show that the aggregates have the property causing person, loses its force. Dharmakirti's views on constitution and identity and its significance for his momentariness thesis commits him to the view that metaphysically real entities are their property particulars. Dharmakirti's view on constitution and identity and its significance for his momentariness thesis commits him to the view that metaphysically real entities just are their property particulars. This is not a view that Dharmakirti defends directly. He seems to back into it, though he does so self-consciously. For Dharmakirti, then, entities are wholly constituted by property particulars. If two entities, A and B, are wholly constituted by exactly the same property particulars, they are numerically identical. If entity A is at least partially constituted by all B property particulars, B is essentially similar to, that is, non-different from A. If entity A is constituted by property particulars that are not B property particulars, B and A are different. Conclusion. If I am right that Dharmakirti's position on constitution and identity underlies his views on non-difference and difference, the success of Dharmakirti's critique of Buddhist personalism depends on the plausibility of this position. In conclusion, it may be worth trying to assess, even if briefly, whether the philosophical price that Dharmakirti expects us to pay for this position is worth the rejection of strongly emergent entities such as persons. Let's consider a pair of putatively related entities, A and B. Let B be clay, and A, the statue that is formed out of it. Every bit of clay is used to make the statue, and nothing other than clay is necessary. If clay and statue were to be a perfect stand-in for aggregates and persons, clay would, on its own, organize itself into the statue. Let us assume that since both are causally efficacious, clay and statue exist, and also that they are taken to be metaphysically real. Let us also assume that the statue exists at T2 and not before, while clay exists at T1 and also perhaps at T2. Here's what Dharmakirti's views seem to commit us to. 1. According to Dharmakirti, since statue A is wholly constituted by clay B, the statue has to be identical to the clay at T2. We need to accept that for any entity pair A and B, A cannot be wholly constituted by B without being identical to it. One cost of Dharmakirti's position on constitution and identity is that clay and statue at T2 have to be metaphysically identical. 2, according to the difference principle, and since A and B are taken to be metaphysically real, statue A must be related to clay B by either RC or RS. Since clay exists at T1, at least, and the statue exists at T2, they have at least one incompatible property particular, which means that they have to be different. even though the pre-fired statue has all of the properties that the basic elements that constitute clay have in common. If they are different, they have to be related through RC. But Dharmakīrti doesn't accept that RC exists. So at T2, the statue, it seems, would have to be related to clay at T1 through RS. For statue A to be related to clay B through RS, A is supposed to have all of the property particulars shared by B. That is, all of the shared property particulars of B. Moreover, property particulars of and property particulars are wholly intentional objects. What exists can only be property particulars and not property particulars that have a property possessor. That is, property particulars of. Given this, A cannot have any B properties, since all B properties are T1 properties, while all A properties are T2 properties. So A at T2 is not related to B at T1 by either RC or RS. But what about statue and clay at T2? At T2, A has all of the properties shared by the basic entities that are B, and in the case of statue and clay, it also has A properties that are not B properties. For example, the property having arms. So statue A seems to be related to clay B through RS, right? But again, properties and property particulars are, according to Dharmakīrti, wholly intentional objects to which the difference principle, which is of metaphysical significance, does not apply. After all, as wholly intentional objects, even though they exist as such, they are not metaphysically real in the way statue and clay were supposed to be. A second cost of Dharmakīrti's view seems to be that statue, entity A, and clay, entity B, are wholly intentional objects. But it's not just these entities, A and B, that would be wholly intentional in Dharmakīrti's view. All purportedly metaphysically real entities, A and B, would be too. To fully support Dharmakīrti's arguments against Buddhist personalism, one has to be willing to bear the cost of A and B being identical when A is wholly constituted by B, and A and B being wholly intentional objects, right? To fully support Dharmakīrti's arguments against Buddhist personalists, one has to be willing to bear the cost of A and B being identical when A is wholly constituted by B, and A and B being wholly intentional objects. The question is whether bearing these costs is worth the rejection of persisting, strongly emergent persons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Professor Parimal. In fact, it's a technically strong paper presented in a very lucid way. This is how I would understand this presentation. In fact, for the sake of our students and friends, other friends who have joined, friends, if you look at the conception in Indian philosophy, you would find self, which is a permanent one, okay, Atmavada, and then we find Buddhist standpoint, which is Nairatmyavada, no self theory. But actually, within Buddhist Nairatmyavada, there are again three variations that are very important to be noted. It is not that Buddhist conception of self is only one mold. It has three variations within it, and this is what is being presented very well by Professor Parimal when he talks about dependent yet different and non-different. Okay, so when these variations within Buddhist fold, when they look at the aggregates of skandhas, is it all three standpoints argue that it is dependent on the aggregates of skandhas, okay, but some group of people argue that it is dependent yet different, and one group argues that it is dependent yet non-different, and the third standpoint is that of Dharmakīrti, which is very important to all of us, and this is what is being presented to us. Thank you so much, Professor Parimal, for this wonderful exposition. And now I open the floor for discussion. Parimal, if you would like to, if you can access this chat box, there are questions that are
oh,
written.
wow. Okay,
Yeah.
a lot of questions.
Would you like to read them and respond, or do you want me to read?
I can read, as long as you can understand me, I can read them. That's fine. That's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. Then please go ahead.
I'll just go in order. Should I go in order? I'll go in order. So clarification sought from Professor Patil is, how would the debate between personalists and their opponents be affected if ontological primacy was granted to processes rather than entities? Okay. I don't think it would make a big difference. A lot would depend on exactly what we think the distinction is between a process and an entity. So if you think of I use the phrase entity because it's quite generic. An entity could be an object, it could be an event, it could be a process. So what we would have to do to figure out whether the debate would be different would be to ask what the metaphysics of entities are versus what the metaphysics of objects are versus the metaphysics of processes, and see where the arguments don't line up or do line up. My gut feeling is that we could rephrase the arguments regardless of whether we take objects to be entities, processes, or processes. That's my guess, but I haven't tried it, so I don't know. Okay. Another question. Such an approach, in my view, would have the advantage of talking about continuity in terms of causal connections and conditions governing processes. Such an approach would have the advantage of talking about continuity. Yes, that's right, that even Buddhists who accept momentariness, who don't accept that there are persisting entities, have to account for the fact that we experience entities as continuing in time. So we have the sense that entities persist, even though they do not metaphysically persist. So how do we account for that sense of persistence? One way, absolutely, would be to try to do it through a causally connected series of moments. So you could definitely do it that way. Could you please, so one question about, could you explain what kind of ontological dependence I'm talking about? Yeah, it's simply that if A is ontologically dependent on B, that A cannot exist without B. B is necessary for the existence of A. And then you can say whether it's necessary and sufficient is a separate issue. Does Dharmakīrti assert the existence of self contrary to the Anatman doctrine? What is the self's role in both samsara and nirvana? So the paper was about two, as Professor Bala said, it's about two different kinds of Buddhists. One Buddhist is the personalist. That Buddhist thinks there are persons, and sometimes they refer to those persons as selves. What matters is that for them, a person persists through time. Dharmakīrti, so that may seem to you to be in contrast to the Anatman doctrine, right? Because the Anatman doctrine we generally take to be the doctrine that there is no entity such as an Atman that persists through time. But there were Buddhists who had a different view of the Anatman doctrine. They said that our view of persons is still an Anatman doctrine. Why? Because it isn't the same as what Nyayikas, Vaisheshikas, Sankhya philosophers say the Atman is. So what's perplexing is there are two versions of Anatman that I've talked about. One is the personalists, who are Buddhist version of Anatman, according to which a person or an Atman is ontologically dependent upon, yet neither different nor non-different from the skandhas. That exists, but it's still not an Atman. It's just a persisting person. And Dharmakīrti's view of an Atman, which says that no, this doesn't exist at all. An Atman is kshanikatva, basically. So another question, sorry. With reference to the distinction between Dharmakīrti makes between swalakshana and samanya lakshana, what would be the nature of the thing per se, the unique particular, which we can apprehend pre-reflectively according to Dharmakīrti in swalakshana? Okay, so according to Dharmakīrti, I'll just say it. According to Dharmakīrti, the swalakshana is just an akara that appears in jnana. That's it. So I'll say a swalakshana is an akara that appears in nirvikalpaka jnana. We can talk about that later. So it's mental, right? Okay. Another question. Do Dharmakīrti and the Pudgalavadins subscribe to the same theory of two truths, one which maintains an ontological distinction between two levels of reality? So I don't think they accept exactly the same theory of two truths. Dharmakirti's view of the truths is interesting and complicated. So I don't think they accept the same view. The way you care, which maintains an ontological distinction between the two levels of reality. So I don't take the two truths as understood by Dharmakirti to refer to an ontological distinction at all. So I don't take the ultimate level to somehow be ontologically distinct. I see them primarily as being epistemological, though it has some ontological significance. We can talk more about that later, but I don't really see them as ontological in quite the way that others do. I don't think that was very helpful to you, but that's a place I'll start. I just want to get to the rest of the questions. You stated that abstracts are constructed metaphysically and according to certain criteria. What kind of criteria are you talking about? So sorry, I wasn't clear. What I meant to say is that suppose you have red pot, right? That means you have a property possessor, the pot, which is the dharmi, and a property, such as being red. So the question is there a real pot? And is there a real color being red? Are there two distinct things? So we can say that the property being red is one thing, and that is had by or possessed by the dharmi, the property possessor. As you know, many philosophers think there are two things. There's a property possessor, ghata, and there is a property being red. Dharmakirti thinks there's only one thing, red pot. And that the way we come up with our notion of, oh, one thing is the property possessor and the other is the property is through a kind of conceptual abstraction. All there is one is red pot. We conceptually distinguish between the pot and the red. That distinction is a conceptual one. It's when it's abstracting out. But that abstraction doesn't have metaphysical significance. Just because for our convenience, we separate out something called pot and something called red, doesn't mean that in the world, there is a thing called pot and there is a thing called red. There's just red pot. So conceptually breaking something apart does not have any metaphysical significance or ontological significance. I hope that helped. Okay. How largely does the principle two real entities are different if and only if they do not overlap draw on the unique character of swalakshana? Okay, so I think what you're at, so as you know very well, the person who asked this question must know the answer. So as you know very well, swalakshana is a point, right? It's momentary, tuck, 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 tuck. So the two swalakshanas are actually totally distinct from each other. They're completely distinct from each other. They share nothing. There's no overlapping at all in the nature of one swalakshana and the nature of another swalakshana, because they're at two temporally distinct moments. So all their properties are temporally indexed. They share no properties. So there's the kind of atyanta bheda between two swalakshanas. I don't know if that helped. Did that help? Okay, well, you can ask. How does Dharmakirti render the agency obtained by the non-persistence? Is there a possibility of purpose and whose? So, oh, I see. How is this a question of how does Dharmakirti explain agency when no thing persists, right? how can you explain agency in a world with only impermanent entities, right? So, good question. So in today's paper, I didn't talk about Dharmakirti's positive view of how he accounts for agency, right? I simply talked about his critique that no persisting entity could be an agent because a persisting entity would have to change. Dharmakirti's view is that agency is simply explained through causation. Remember, agency is an idea, it's a concept. So we need to make sense of that concept. To make sense of that concept, we appeal to a notion such as causation. I mean, simply. The metaphysics of agency is complicated because there is no metaphysics of agency. There's just momentariness. Change, in a way, is intrinsic to whatever there is, right? This is also the case with the Abhidharma, right? Change is just intrinsic, in a sense. Well, not to Abhidharma, say, let's stick to Sautrantika kinds of Dignaga, moving toward Dignaga views of understanding continua. Change is intrinsic. If causal connections are not real, then what is the status of property particulars for him? If causal connections are not real, what is the status of property particulars for him? So property particulars are, you could think of a property particular as a swalakshana. And so they are momentary. What's important about causal connections means that causal relations aren't real. You can have an account of causation without an account of a causal relation. So for example, suppose I think that there's a cause and an effect. And I think there's a third thing, a relation that connects the cause and effect, right? So I have three things: cause, effect, relation. Dharmakirti's view is that there is no relation. There's no relation. There's no relation. There's no real relation. All there is this. So the cause itself, there's nothing, the cause itself tells you about its effect. The cause itself is causal, right? It's not that there's a cause that at some point can have a relation of being a cause to an effect. It's not that there's a thing that at some point comes to be a cause of this effect. There's always just the thing that can be a cause. So there's no separate relation. That's a little bit simple and crude, but it gets the basic intuition out, I think. Is merely sense of self, or is self ontologically, which is persistent? Oh, in Dharmakirti. So I don't think I was clear enough. Dharmakirti does not accept that there is any kind of entity that persists. So he does not think there is any kind of metaphysically real self. He obviously thinks that we can have the idea of a self, right? Obviously he thinks that. He just thinks that that idea is false. He thinks that you cannot prove that there is an entity such as a self. So while we can entertain the idea of self, we can also entertain the idea of a rabbit's horn. We can also entertain the idea of many fictional things. So self is just a fictional thing. And just like rabbit's horn, it's a fictional thing that you cannot prove the existence of. There are other fictional things. Fire, right? Fire is also wholly intentional, but some fictional things you can prove the existence of. So we have the personalists who think that persons are metaphysically real. Dharmakirti doesn't think there's any metaphysically real entities, but he does think there are real entities. They're just wholly intentional. And there are different types of wholly intentional real things. There's some wholly intentional entities like Atma, which I can think about just like I can think about a ghost. But an Atman you can't prove. Then there are wholly intentional things like fire. And fire I can prove through Anumana. So we shouldn't think that just because things are wholly intentional, that you can't prove that they exist through a pramana. But you cannot do that with Atman. You cannot do that with Ishvara. You cannot do that with Pudgala. Okay. Dharmakirti was a Chittamatra philosopher, if I'm not wrong. Sorry, I'll read it louder. Dharmakirti was not a Chittamatra, was a Chittamatra philosopher, if I am not wrong. How would we account for his mind-only view then, as far as selflessness is concerned? because that objectivity of mind still persists as per Chittamatra school, which Dharmakirti advocates, if I am not wrong. Okay, correct. Dharmakirti is a Chittamatra philosopher, even though not everyone agrees. The reason not everyone agrees is that Pramanavartika is a very cagey work, in that, in my view, he's trying to create a philosophical system that is as palatable to as many Buddhists as possible. So he actually suppresses his own views on metaphysics and ontology. He only appeals to them when necessary. But I think it's still pretty clear that he is a mind-only philosopher. So the question is, if you're a mind-only philosopher, does mind persist? Dharmakirti, you think there's mind. That's all there is. Does it persist? He says, no, mind doesn't persist, because it's not like there is mind. There's just mind, right? It's just a momentary, it's just a series. So mind doesn't persist, though you can still have mind, right? The standard example of a flame, right? Constantly flickering. All right, what is difference? Good question. Is it in terms of degree or in terms of kind? Okay, so the whole paper was about different ways of accounting for difference, right? One way we talked about it was that two entities are different when one of them has a property that is incompatible with the properties that all of the entities of the other type have in common. So if you say that all of the dharmas are momentary, and you say a person who is wholly constituted by the dharmas persists, then the person is different, is bheda from the dharmas. Why? Because the person has a property, persistence, which is incompatible with with the properties that all these dharmas have in common. So therefore, it's different. For Dharmakirti, Dharmakirti says two things are bheda if their natures do not overlap. And for Dharmakirti, remember, what is an entity? An entity is just a bundle of properties. So two entities that share no properties in common are different in that sense. Okay, how to compare Hume's causation with that of Dharmakirti? Yep, good question. It depends if you're an old Humean or a new Humean with regard to your interpretation of Hume on causation. So it's a tricky question, because Dharmakirti clearly is a nominalist about causal relations. Yet he still, remember, it's a wholly intentional object for Dharmakirti. It's not metaphysically real. But you can still show that there are wholly intentional objects, right? You can still show that fire and smoke are related through this causal relation. So he's an empiricist. He thinks you can establish that two things are related in effect and cause through a series of observations and non-observations. So it is empiricist in that sense. However, the success of those observations and non-observations actually rely on metaphysical principles having to do with kshanikatva also. So it's a little bit too much to go into all the details of that now. Another question. Does the view of Dharmakirti on constitutional identity of entities give rise to what one might call empty ontology? If so, does it contradict his note? Good. So I think if by empty ontology, you mean that does it commit Dharmakirti to there only being wholly intentional objects? That is, objects that do not have any kind of intrinsic nature. That is, objects that do not have swabhava of a certain sort. Then I think the answer is yes, it commits into wholly intentional objects. It commits into there being only mind. It commits into there being only akaras. So I said earlier that a swalakshana is just an akara. Sorry, akara. A swalakshana, what there fundamentally is just the content of a conscious event. What there fundamentally is, a swalakshana, is just the content of a non-conceptual awareness event. Swalakshana is just the content of a non-conceptual awareness event. Now, that content of a non-conceptual awareness event, right, is a swalakshana. It exists, in that it has causal efficacy. So it is a real thing. Everything else is wholly intentional. Everything else is wholly intentional. So wholly intentional objects are fully constituted by their parts, but they're not identical to their parts, to their selection of parts. So the ontology about wholly intentional objects is empty in the sense that there is no one property that makes that object the kind of object that it is. There's no ghatatva, for example, or anything like that. But the content of awareness events, awareness events, cognitions do have one intrinsic property, right? Awareness events, cognitions have one swabhava. Their swabhava is that they have their swasamvedana, right? All awareness events are reflexively aware of themselves. So one reason Madhyamaka, middle way Buddhist philosophers, don't like mind-only philosophers and don't like reflexive awareness, swasamvitti, is because basically swasamvitti is a swabhava of all jnanas. Sorry. Reflexive awareness is an intrinsic and essential property of all awareness events. And if you're a middle way philosopher, you don't want anything to have you don't want anything to have this kind of intrinsic nature. So they reject it. But for Dharmakīrti, every awareness event, independent of its content, has an intrinsic feature of being reflexively aware of itself. The swalakshana you could take to be the content of an awareness event, non-conceptually, right? When you conceptually process it, then you have a wholly intentional object. Whenever processing is involved, it becomes wholly intentional. And those wholly intentional objects do not have a swabhava, do not have any intrinsic nature. And therefore, those wholly intentional objects are empty in that sense. Though most of what we do in our daily life is deal with wholly intentional objects. Was that okay? Look, Dharmakīrti, as you know, is very difficult, and I really is difficult, especially difficult for me. And it's always a struggle for me to figure out how to talk about Dharmakīrti's ideas in a way that's clear and to philosophers. And so I'm sorry they didn't have a handout, which would have helped, I think, make things clearer. But don't feel bad if you don't understand something. Just keep asking questions because we're all in this together. This is a collective effort at understanding Dharmakīrti's critique of the Pudgalavadins. Okay. The question pertains to sattva anumana. Okay. The question pertains to the sattva anumana, that is the inference from existence argument, whereby Dharmakīrti defends the thesis that everything is momentary because of its existence. In the Agamadambara, this is a play by Bhattajayanta, a Nyaya philosopher who comes after Dharmakīrti, there appears a possible objection to the sattva anumana as raised by a Mimamsa philosopher, namely that the argument is fraught with the fallacy of asadharana anaikantika. Let's call that the fallacy of being generally inconclusive. Since for the inference, okay, does everyone know what that is? Generally inconclusive means when you have, okay, I'll assume everyone knows what it is for now. We can take a second back. Asadharana anaikantika, okay. Since for the inference, sound, here's the argument, sound is eternal because it is audible. The reason, audibility, belongs exclusively to the paksha, the sight, sound. And therefore, it is impossible to produce a supporting example, which is different from the paksha. This is technical. So basically, the idea here is that in this anumana, it's the claim is that it's asadharana anaikantika because there's no sapakshe, there's no sapakshe sattvam, because the paksha is the only thing there is. So for example, sound is the only thing that has a property of being audible. You can't come up with a corroborating example other than sound. And therefore, if the rules of your if the rules for a good argument require that you be able to come up with a corroborating example other than the one you're arguing about, then your argument fails. Okay. In Dharmakīrti's case, everything is momentary because of its existence. There's the absence of sapaksha, since how is Dharmakīrti's argument to be defended against the attack? Right, very good. Sorry, this is technical. So those of you who aren't cursed to be interested in Dharmakīrti, We'll just have to sort of close your ears for the next minute. It's the, Professor Chaturvedi, as you know, it's the Badhaka Pramana. It's through the Sadhaka Badhaka Pramana that he does this. And when you use a Badhaka Pramana, he doesn't think you need to have this same Sapakshe Sattvam kind of criteria, because for Dharmakīrti, the Trairupya isn't used to define Vyapti. Vyapti is defines the Trairupya. So in the old Dignaga system, the way in which Asadharana Nikantika was understood is different than the way in which it's understood in Dharmakīrti's updated epistemology. So I would say the way to think about it is to say, is there a way that Trairupya can be satisfied without having to show Sapakshe Sattvam? If I show Karikarana Bhava or I show Tadatmya between Hetu and Sadhya, is that sufficient to guarantee that Trairupya is satisfied? If so, then the fact that there isn't, strictly speaking, a Sapaksha isn't going to be a problem. That's one answer. The second is, this is precisely what's at stake in the Antarvyapti debates. So in Ratnakara Shanti's Antarvyapti Samarthana and the Antarvyapti debates that you find in commentaries on the Hetu Bindu and Hetu Bindu Tika, you begin to see there's another strategy. So one strategy is to say, look, the Paksha is sound, right? Sound tokens. But I'm just going to take, right? It's not, but I'll just take one of the sound tokens out of the Paksha. So I'll say it's all sound except for this sound, hello, right? And then I'll show that hello is a Sapaksha. It's another way of doing it. But this is the Antarvyapti debate, basically. So I would say, look at the Badhaka Pramana. Okay. The question is not directly related to your topic, but your establishment in the Indian philosophy can grant me liberty to ask it. Yes, of course. Please answer. As we can see, the vertical development in Western philosophy, it's not in Indian philosophy. What are the future possibilities in Indian philosophy, specifically an Indian philosophy student like me? I too okay. So maybe if you could explain, I don't understand what vertical development means. Does that mean progress? Is vertical development, should I understand that? What does vertical development mean? If
Yes,
you could just say.
Yes, sir. From
Okay.
we can see that from Greek philosophy to this analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. And you are still talking about, means in Indian philosophy we are talking about Dharmakīrti, which I think is 7th, 8th century scholar. Am I clear, sir?
No, so in contemporary Euro-American philosophy, we talk about everyone from pre-Socratics to contemporary philosophers working today, Timothy Williamson, right? And so now
Yes,
are you
sir.
saying in Indian philosophy, why don't we do that?
I mean that there is a vertical development we can see in Western philosophy. There are traditions, like analytical tradition is a new one. There are philosophy of language. It has been developed.
Yeah, I see. That is true even more so with Indian philosophy. Whatever kind of, this idea of development and different movements and different trends is absolutely, even more so the case in Indian philosophy. And we're just talking about Sanskrit philosophy. Forget the other kinds of Indian philosophy. It's absolutely there. For example, let's take a simple example. Before Dignaga, philosophy in India was totally different. So for example, before Dignaga, there were almost no real debates between Buddhists and non-Buddhists. It's only after Dignaga. Why? Because Dignaga succeeded in creating a shareable epistemic vocabulary, a shareable epistemic framework that made all kinds of new debates possible. So that could be a difference. What about another huge difference? You see in the work of Udayana, a transition from the Atma Tattva Viveka to the Kusumanjali. In the Atma Tattva Viveka, the critics are Buddhists. In the Kusumanjali, it's basically Mimamsakas. In Udayana's work, we see a major shift taking place in the intellectual landscape, right? After Udayana, in the Navya period, Buddhists are gone. There's really no new Buddhist text being produced, so the opponents shift. It's a radical shift when all of a sudden you have Nayayikas arguing primarily with Prabhakaras and Bhattas and Vayakaranas, right? Instead of arguing with Buddhists. Another huge shift. I'll give you another kind of shift. when all of a sudden we begin to see in Udayana and Shashadhara, and then in the Chintamani, a new kind of vocabulary, a new attention to technical detail, that's another shift. Because what happened in the Navya period of Navya Nyaya is that we went from a deep concern with ontology to a concern with the structure of our thoughts. So discussions about ontology became discussions about Shabdabodha, another huge shift. So I could give you dozens and dozens of shifts. The word development is interesting. If by development we mean that people learn from each other, that obviously happens in Indian philosophy. If we mean there's progress, then we need to talk about what we mean by progress, right, in philosophy. So I think that I think that it's almost impossible to come up with, well, let me put it this way. There are, of course, important differences between the way in which philosophy was done in India and the way philosophy is done in Europe and America. And if there weren't differences, then there would be no reason for us to study both of them, right? If they were the same, we could just study one of them. It'd be a lot easier. For me, it'd be a lot easier just to study in English, right? But they're different. And what we need to do, especially students of Indian philosophy, we need to I think what we need to do is this. We need to say, if Dharmakīrti or Gangesha or Raghunatha or Harsha or Udayana were here today, how would they explain their views to colleagues who don't know Sanskrit? And what kinds of questions would they ask their non-Sanskrit writing colleagues? And how would they answer the questions that non-Sanskrit writing colleagues would ask them? So for example, if Udayana were here, the first thing I would do is teach him about the contemporary science of visual perception. And say, Udayana, there's no Indriya that goes out into the world and touches something and comes back. How do you respond? Udayana, I'm sure, would say, okay, that doesn't affect my theory. It just affects the basic structural principles of the science. I'm all happy to read your science, right? These people, the philosophers we are studying who are writing in Sanskrit, were not writing just for people at their time. They were making arguments that they thought were important for everybody. If they were here today, they would be reading everything, just like we read everything, and they'd be participating in contemporary debates. One thing we can do is learn how to accurately represent their views and arguments, accurately, not just pretending that we know what they're saying. Accurately understand their views and arguments, and how we can then articulate them to our colleagues who don't know Sanskrit. And that's not easy. It's not easy to explain Dharmakirti's arguments clearly in contemporary English or Hindi or anything. And we're as a scholarly community, people who work in Indian philosophy are not very good at that. They tend to only talk to each other. So I don't know if there's more questions like that you want to ask. How does Dharmakirti explain the idea of person in terms of swalakshan and momentariness? Okay. So as I said, Dharmakirti does not believe that persons exist. So what he has to explain then is what our idea of person is. Just like he has to explain our idea of Atman, even though he doesn't think an Atman exists. So we have an idea, person. That idea is false in that there is no thing out there in the world called person. Person is also not the kind of thing you could prove through any source of knowledge. So person is just a fiction. And unlike the fiction fire, which is a convenient fiction, person is an inconvenient fiction. Because if you think a person persists, that's going to commit you to this problem of, if you think a person persists, it's going to result in the personalistic fallacy, right? The Satkaya Drishti problem. So he's not trying to explain, he's trying to say that the kind of person that the Pudgalavadan thinks there is doesn't exist. And the concept of person is a fiction, an inconvenient fiction versus a convenient fiction. Kshanikatva is a convenient fiction, right? Kshanikatva is a convenient fiction. Pudgala is an inconvenient fiction. I mean, that's a little bit cheeky, but you get the idea.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Parimal, for this response to various concerns that our friends have raised. In fact, just to, I know we have exhausted a lot of your time, but even then I am tempted to respond to what Himanshu has said. Himanshu, basically, your concern, I understand, is of the concern of many of the students who freshly get into philosophy and try to understand and look at Indian philosophy and also study Western philosophy at the same time, and wonder that Western philosophy, there are so many disjunctures and traditions that have developed, but we don't see such kind of thing in Indian philosophy. This is the concern most of the students come out with. I understand this concern, but basically I think this is wrongly, this is because of wrong way of teaching Indian philosophy itself, which Daya Krishna has been pointing out, has pointed out before, saying that the way we are teaching Indian philosophy to our students in terms of folded and boxed kind of cased kind of study, that's what is actually the problem is. But otherwise, Indian philosophy is still living, and only thing is you have to play your part. Let you look at it and try to come out with interesting things.
Let me say this, if I could.
Please.
I'm generally an open-minded and tolerant person. The one thing I cannot tolerate is I cannot tolerate anyone talking about the 6 systems of Indian philosophy. It is historically irresponsible and philosophically bankrupt way for us to think about Indian philosophy. Now, look, you might be able to use that. This is a very strong statement. You may be able to use it as a way of teaching a course, but if people leave that course thinking that the 6 systems is somehow useful and meaningful as a way of understanding the philosophical landscape of pre-modern India, it's a complete, utter, total disaster. So we need to get rid of all of that, because it results in exactly the kind of problem I think that Himanshu is rightly recognizing, that students recognize. So that's my one very strong statement about that. Let me say what the alternative is. The alternative is treat these philosophers as people. They're not schools. There's no such thing as the Nyaya school. Do you know any philosophers who agree with each other? I don't. Nyaya philosophers don't agree with each other. Yes, what makes them Nyayikas? They're all committed to developing their views in critical engagement with the Nyaya Sutras. One person says the Nyaya Sutra says A, the other person says Nyaya Sutra says B. They don't actually, their primary purpose is not to do exegesis of the Nyaya Sutra. It's to develop their philosophical frameworks in conversation with the Nyaya Sutra. So treat philosophers as individuals. Read Vachaspati, Udyotakara, Udayana. Tell me what they say. Quote their texts. If they're having a debate with someone, go read that person's text. Don't say words like Nyaya philosophy says this, Vaisheshika philosophy says this. It results in a kind of ossification. That's one point. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't general tendencies. So one should say, Nyayikas generally take there to be an Atman. That's fine, right? Nyayikas generally take there to be dravyas. That's fine. But that's not philosophically interesting. What's interesting is why they say that, what the alternatives are, what arguments they think they're going to persuade us. So my one point about this is focus on individuals, not so-called schools. And ask yourself, if those individuals were here today, how would they explain their argument? How would they explain it in contemporary English? This is not easy. And one of the difficulties with Indian philosophy in particular is that unless you are very good at reading classical Sanskrit, you're stuck with translations. And reading a translation is actually very hard. Even reading a very good translation is very hard. So people get confused. I don't know about you, but when I read Kant in English, it's hard. And I'm a native English speaker. It's hard. Translation, that's a good translation of Kant, is hard. We don't have many good translations of Indian texts. Actually, we have very, 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 very few. We have lots of English reconstructions of Sanskrit texts. Everyone know what I mean? English reconstruction of Sanskrit text is not an English translation. My colleagues who are philosophers, who are native English speakers, have no idea what 90% of the so-called translations of Sanskrit texts say. I don't understand what most of them say, and I have to go back and look at the original. So those of you who are studying Indian philosophy who aren't going to be learning Sanskrit well, learning Sanskrit well does not mean Ramaha Rama or Ramaha, right? It means actually being able to read untranslated Sanskrit text. That's not for everybody. and you don't have to do that. But what you have to be able to learn to do is read and make use of translations. And it's difficult. And what I would recommend is you start, how do you decide what topic to work on if you don't know Sanskrit well? Don't start with whatever has a good translation. Otherwise, you're stuck, right? If you decide you want to work on, I'm not going to name any philosophers. Suppose you want to work on philosopher X. You don't read Sanskrit very, very well. Then you're stuck with a bad translation or secondary material. It's hopeless. You'll have no fun, you'll be miserable, and you won't produce great work. Instead, focus on something that has a great translation that you can then discover what's interesting about. And learning one thing well will help you learn everything well later on. So sorry for this methodological rant, but I feel that the study of Indian philosophy is at such a critical time now. I'll give you an example. At Harvard, for example, we created a PhD program in Indian philosophy. We have people who graduated. Those people are all teaching now at 2 of them at our peer institutions. There's tremendous interest in Sanskrit philosophy and Indian philosophy. What the limitation is, there just aren't great teaching materials. In Delhi, you're actually all very lucky because Alex Watson, who's at Aśoka, is an excellent translator. His texts are very well translated. English speakers can read them, just like we can read Kant. You need to be taught the text. So I think that we need things like that more of. Otherwise, it's very hard to see. And the existing secondary literature is deeply problematic. It's extremely useful if you know how to use it well. So I would say focus on individuals, focus on issues, and if you don't know Sanskrit well, focus on good translations. If you do know Sanskrit well, every day, no matter what, you spend at least 1 hour reading a text that your professors did not tell you to read. Every day you find a Sanskrit text that you want to read and you sit down and you read it. 1 hour every day, that's it. From now until, I do it to this day. As you know, I write on Shastra. So every day I spend an hour reading Kavya. It's just part of the Sanskrit sadhana. Many of you are probably much better at Sanskrit than I will ever be. But for me, this is what I need to do. And I would recommend for students who are doing Indian philosophy to do that. Eventually, you'll get there. You may not have to choose a dissertation topic that requires it, but eventually you'll get there. Sorry, that was a rant. I took too much of your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that suggestion. In fact, Nivedita Chaturvedi is working on debates on debates on between Dharmakīrti and Parimal.
Right.
Excellent.
Right.
So you're taking that's excellent. So you're taking Aśoka Vartika, the Pratyaksha Paricheda, and book beyond. 3 of the Pramana Vartika.
And beyond the Pratyaksha Paricheda to the consequent chapters as well, because they involve the refutation of the idealist position of the Buddhist as well.
You mean in Kumarila?
So
you're working on Kumarila, right. In Kumarila, and Dharmakīrti's so-called kind of response to Kumarila, is that it?
Right, Professor, but I'm also looking at the Pramana Vartika and the Nyaya Bindu.
Oh, right, naturally, yeah. That section of the Pramana Vartika, as you know, is really hard and not as well studied and not as well studied.
Right, Professor. I had to go down to Pune to learn it with Professor Pradeep Gokhale, and he taught me words.
Yeah, well, you found the absolute right person.
Very kind enough to teach me words by words.
Actually, I should tell you that Pradeep is the first person, is not the first, when I first started studying Sanskrit, Pradeep was the one who read text with me. And the first text he read with me was the Nyaya Pravesha. And I don't think that I would be, without him, I don't think I ever would have learned anything. So you found absolutely the right person. He's a remarkable person.
He's very helpful.
Very kind.
Yeah, very kind.
He's not only a good person, but he is so insightful and such a good reader of Sanskrit texts. He's really remarkable. He, in a way, combines the best of the traditional system and the modern system. So I have great respect for him.
Yeah, great.
Right, Professor.
Thank
And you've urged me to look at the inference of Dharmakīrti, and I'll surely look at that.
Yeah, and I think that you obviously have I think it's a great topic, and especially, as you said, you're focusing on Kumarila, which is great, and Dharmakīrti, which is great, because that's two people and a real debate that kind of took place. And so the material is finite, which is good. And as you know, there's a lot of people working around those topics. So you have good material to look at. I would say the most difficult thing is this swalakshana, samanya lakshana business, which has really kind of taken over the debate. I don't think that that's actually, that the swalakshana, samanya lakshana issue is not really what's important in the debate between Kumarila and Dharmakīrti on pratyaksha. It's other things. That might just be the vocabulary that's used, but it's not about swalakshanas and samanya lakshanas. It's about the content of awareness events, how you get conceptual content and non-conceptual content, whether you can call the conceptual content pratyaksha or not, why or why not, right? All that stuff. So good, very good. Feel free to be in touch if you have questions about this. Yeah,
I will write to you, definitely. Thank you so much.
please do. Yeah, my pleasure.
Great. Let me conclude by thanking Professor Parimal for this wonderful session, a very lucid talk of the technically strong paper, and then subsequent interaction with all our friends who have their concerns that they have expressed, and also taking out time. It's early in the morning, around 8 o'clock, he is ready to talk to us, and then we exhausted almost 2 hours of his time. Thank you so much, Parimal, for this.
No, thank you. It's always nice to talk to people about this material.
Yeah, we also look forward to future possible collaborations and academic interactions with you. And let me also thank my colleagues and students who have joined us today and made this interaction very vibrant and interesting and insightful as well. Good morning to you. Have a good day, Parimal, and good night to friends.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Namaste.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.